Hey, so today I had a family member share a story with me of something that happened to them just recently. And the story that they shared, while it shook me to the core of what happened to them, it shook me even more to the core of how they handled the situation. So just recently, my family member, who's an electrician, was working on a job. And at the time, he was working at a breaker box. And before he had a chance to even see that something was wrong with the breaker box caught on fire. Well, he was right there at the breaker box. He caught on fire too. So while he was trying to beat the fire out, it didn't go out. So he began to roll around on the floor. He did get the fire out. It didn't go out immediately, so he had burns. So while my family member was at the site, he had an apprentice with him. And what shook me to the core is how the apprentice said my family member handled this situation. The apprentice said to my family member, "You are not a regular human. There is something so different about you." Why did the apprentice say this to my family member? It's because the apprentice witnessed my family member gather himself together, get up, and my family member looked at the apprentice and said, "Why are you looking at me? We got work to do." The apprentice said my family member got up and went and finished the job. Burns and all. How? Now, no, I'm not saying, that's what we should do in a situation like that. And yes, the ambulance were on the way. So they did call 911. And he did end up going to the hospital. It was very serious. But the point I'm trying to make, how he handled that situation. He still said, "We have a job to do." He went through that fire and he still pulled himself together. And so this raised the question even more in me. Am I willing? Am I willing when God gives me a task to complete the task? Am I willing to go through whatever it is that I have to go through? Get myself together and get up and complete the task. Am I willing to go through being mocked? Am I willing to go through discomfort? Am I willing to go through pain and shame, being betrayed by those that I thought who really loved me? Am I willing? Am I willing to have to walk away from what I once knew? Am I willing to set my pride aside and to humbly go and do what it is that God has for me to do? Am I willing? Let's go to the word. So in the book of Nehemiah, we're introduced to Nehemiah himself. And Nehemiah was a man of God who at the time was a servant for the king Artaxerxes in Persia. So Nehemiah had been given the task by God to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the wall. Why was this task given to him? Well, God had a bigger plan. God had something much greater, far beyond what Nehemiah or anyone else knew in that moment to do. But God said, go and do it. Artaxerxes gave his blessing for Nehemiah to do just that. Artaxerxes not only gave his blessing, but he also gave some resources to get him started, and he also made sure he safely got to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was given this task by God for him to do, and so Nehemiah, in obedience, went to Jerusalem so that he could complete the task. When Nehemiah made it to Jerusalem, he had supplies, and he had people who were willing to work, or as it said in the Word of God, they had a mind to work. And ultimately, he had God on his side. But even with God on his side, he still had enemies. Enemies who were trying to put turbulence in his task. Enemies who were trying to stop what God had told Nehemiah to do. Enemies who did not want it to come to pass. Who did not want it to happen. So, with that, Nehemiah didn't let it bother him. Nehemiah kept going. Nehemiah kept speaking the word of God. He encouraged the people. Because the enemies that he had tried to put fear into him. The enemies that he had tried to put fear into the people. They mocked him. They threatened him. They tried to trick and deceive him. He was picked on. He was lied to. He had a friend that even betrayed him. They tried to get under his skin so that he could operate in anger, so that he can operate in his own pride and say, okay, you want to talk? Well, let me show my face. Let me show you that I'm not playing. Instead, Nehemiah kept to the task. He got himself together each and every time. And he said, we have work to do. Let's get the job done. Nehemiah had to alter plans. He had to change things around. He had to put people in certain places. But even still, he kept with the task. He didn't stop. And in the end, the task was completed. The task was done. He stood in obedience. He continued to speak the word of God and what God had spoken to him. And he didn't have to argue the word. He didn't have to go back and forth. He simply said what thus said the Lord. Because Nehemiah decided to say, I'm willing. Because Nehemiah decided to say, I won't allow anyone to stop what God has told me to do. I have a job that I must complete. I have a task that I have to get done. And so it was done. So I want to leave you with this. Just as the question was posed to me, with the testimony that was given to me, and with the example of Nehemiah and the word of God, I pose the same question to you. In the midst of all this adversity, in the midst of all this false teaching, these false doctrine, these false prophets, in the midst of all this blasphemy, in the midst of all of these things, are you willing to feel discomfort to still stand for Christ? Are you willing to feel discomfort to still do the will of God? In the last days, which are present and prevalent all around us, you will be mocked. You will be talked about. Are you willing? Because adversity is here. And if it has not knocked on your door as of yet, if you have not felt the fire as of yet, it's coming. But when it comes, are you willing? So just as I pray for my strength continually, just as I pray for my boldness continually, just as I pray that just as God had Nehemiah's back, that I continue to remember that he has mine too. I pray the same for you. I pray for our comfort when adversity comes. I pray that we not only hear the truth, not only be hearers of the word, but do what the word of God says also. So in the midst of all this adversity, when there's so much lying, so much deception, so many false teachers, so many false prophets, so many demonic attacks that are coming, so many wiles of the enemy that are present in this day, are we still going to say, I got a job to do?